Hello, VRTO. My name is Hunter Fox. I've been doing Web 3D and VR 3D modeling particularly for the last 7 years. I've worked with Janus VR. Some of you may have heard of it. We have been to the live VRTO events, I think, in 2016 and 2017. I worked with them for almost 5 years. 2 years working with Decentraland, which is like a crypto-based 3D web environment, and another entire year with Decentraland or Decentral Games. But I'm actually not here on behalf of them. I'm here just to just talk about 3D from my own experience. A lot of my stuff is you may have seen in the news. I worked on the Atari Casino project that was recently out there. I've done a lot of work with quite a few crypto companies, Rarible, Matic, Polygon. Most of my work, unfortunately, is NDA, so I can't really talk about it. But I've actually worked with a fellow speaker here, David Plant at Trinity Square Video. So that was a long time ago, probably 2016. I'm self-taught. I got really lucky when I started with Janus VR. That's where all this journey began. Working with several PhD grads at Janus, and they basically taught me the ropes of like low-level optimization as I was learning 3D. So I would like to think I have a pretty good grasp of the ins and outs of how your computer actually processes 3D, which has helped me immensely in making optimized 3D models. So to get started here, I'm going to explain what not to do first. So this is for people that have a better understanding of 3D. If you don't understand it, I'll have a part near the end of this where I talk about how to get started if you're a beginner. But if you understand 3D, this will help explain some of the stuff not to do. So first things first, texture loads, and by the way, this is all for in particular Web 3D. This is not really focused on like Unity and Unreal style game development or game development houses and stuff like that with their own proprietary engines, because well, the web is going 3D very quickly, and I think we need more people that understand how all this stuff works. But all right, so let's get started here. So basically, texture loads are extreme on WebVR. Because of the downloads. You have to download all these textures. Everything has to be streaming essentially from a server. So you want to cut your server costs as much as you can, but you also don't want the end customer to wait forever. So on that regard, you want to use tiling textures as much as you possibly can. And to illustrate, I have a 10,000 square meter section here. With quite high texture detail. It's just a 512 texture that's tiling. That's all it is. And let's see here. So if you don't use a tiling texture to get this texture resolution that you have here out of something like Substance Painter or ZBrush style setups, where it's a single image for the entire model or an entire environmental scene or the whatever, you're going to need, in this case, for 10,000 square meters, right? Because I'm tiling this at 512. But if you wanted a single texture with this amount of texture resolution, you'd need 100 million times more pixels to cover that 10,000 square meters at the same resolution. That's like literally, it's 26 trillion pixels versus 262,000 pixels for the 512. So that's a huge gain in how all this works. Use tiling textures as much as you can, and if you must, use ZBrush, which I would recommend for stuff like character models and things like that, or in Substance Painter, single UV maps. I would only use those, but I would avoid using them if you possibly can. Don't paint an entire environmental scene or an entire building with ZBrush, or otherwise you're going to have huge textures or really, really bad resolution. Same thing goes with photogrammetry. Try to optimize it as much as you possibly can. I would err on the side of you don't need ultra high quality yet. because our computers are just not capable of doing that, and mobile's even worse. For mobile, you want to use really small textures, definitely only tiling textures, pretty much everything except character models, I would say. Okay, so yeah, and here's the difference of a 512 texture on a cube, where one side has 512 on each side, just tiled together, right? There's six UV maps here overlaid on top of each other within the 0 to 1 bounds. This one is just how Blender does a cube, but you can see the difference in texture resolution. It's absolutely horrendous on there. So that's that, right? That's texture loads are extreme on WebVR. Try to make everything small. Next one, subpixel or subtexel rendering. Now this is actually an issue on all Unity everything, but Unity and Unreal generally they'll like create LODs for you automatically, which is level of detail models. This would be an example of like something very far away, and this is something that you would see up close if you just wanted a sphere, right? Now what subpixel texel rendering, what that means is essentially at a certain distance, basically a single pixel or single polygon or mesh section, texel basically, at some distance that is going to become smaller than a pixel, and your computer actually has to work much more to sort that out and actually display basically the nearest neighbor type situation. So you want to avoid having any mesh that is smaller at any level of distance. Like this would be way too high a poly for this thing at this distance, because each one of these texels are smaller than a pixel that you're rendering. So you want to avoid that. So wherever you can, go with a larger texels for your models. That's a big help for performance. It's just the way your GPU kind of renders this stuff. It's just very difficult for it to sort which one of these it's actually going to show at a distance. So that's that. Next one, your alpha depth sorting. Now, some engines are better than others. Web engines tend to be absolutely horrendous at this. So you want to avoid, where possible, having these stacked on top of each other, right? Because Blender actually is doing a fairly good job here. Some engines and like I said, most web engines are very bad at this. So you want to avoid this. And from the performance standpoint, the sorting algorithms that computers use to do this, it's very, very taxing. So if you have to use alpha, in a scene, like for trees, glass windows, stuff like that, if you have to use them, keep them very, very large. Like you want to make these as big as possible. The quads particularly. These are, these that have little pie slices, basically, of triangles, is how these would look meshed out, but or at least how the computer would see it. But you want to make these large quad, like a single big ass sorry, I don't know if I can cuss here, but a big window plane essentially is what you want to use. So, and if you have to use trees, use them very sparingly, because they are particularly bad on web engines, because just the sheer number of polygons and like the depth sorting issue of trying to figure out what's in front of what. That's what depth sorting means. It's the Z buffer, essentially, if you're more familiar with that. So yeah, avoid alpha wherever possible. If you have to use it, make it big, and try not to use trees at all, because we don't have shader-based vegetation. So another one, on to the next point, baked lighting. Okay, you want to use baked lighting wherever possible. It is significantly more performant, especially on web engines, because they're not really optimized for this. But you can use, if your engine has dynamic lighting and it's fairly performant, then I would say, go for that, just based on ease of like making models for it, because it's quite difficult to bake for web engines, because it's not like Unity, Unreal. those engines do it all for you. So in this case, you basically have to manually do it. And to go on to the tips and tricks of how to actually do that in the best way possible, take this plane for example. There are no lights here. This is a baked lighting here, and you can see it's actually ray traced essentially onto the ground. So what that bake actually looks like, bear with me here. This is what the bake looks like for this entire huge plane. Alright, so one of the tips that I can give you is if the color of the shadow is essentially the same all the way across, you can actually use significantly less UV map space, right? Like a lot less. So in this case, like probably 95% of this tiled plane is covered by only 25% of the UV map bake. The part that you need crisp shadows, that section is this entire section of it. So it's 75% for this small area. As you can see, it's very small in comparison. So that is a huge tip right here on how to bake, and you want to set that on a second UV map. So that's how I do this. If I zoom out here, you can see how much bigger the tiled section is. It's like times 100 right here. So that's on the first UV map. This is the second UV map essentially for the bake. Your engine may not support this but if you can and you have the ability, I would add this capability in via GLTF. The Kronos Group doesn't have a spec for this yet, so you kind of have to hack it in essentially by manually defining it in code. But that's more in depth, and I want to go with this conversation here. Let's see. So now I guess we'll go to my visual philosophy. So essentially, I got hugely inspired by great architects of the world. Zaha Hadid, Adrian Smith, Frank Gehry. Those are probably the most well-known architects out there. But it depends on what your style is, what you want to do. But I would say you don't need for VR stuff like that. Some things that you just don't need are like chairs, trash cans, bathrooms. You can add those in just for like style, like for example here. And if you have a seating animation within your engine, you can make use of these, put points down to have people sit. But generally speaking, you want them wide open, very wide open spaces for 3D. And you don't need a lot of detail, especially on the website, right? Because the engines just are not as capable as something like Unreal and Unity performance-wise. So, wide open, large, like think of like corporate offices or something along those lines. That's sort of my design philosophy. Here's the Atari. Set you up there. So there you can see Z fighting. Didn't lower these enough. So that is my design philosophy. Just make them smooth, learn from the best, pick up a book on architecture, whatever your favorite style is, just try to do it that way. Which leads me to like basic tips and tricks. Again, study the architects. There are design philosophies for every kind of possible style you can imagine, unless you're doing some really out there abstract stuff. So that's first things first, and then basically from there, you just want to start practicing. Basically, get Blender. Go on Sketchfab, download stuff you think is cool, and actually look at how other people are designing stuff. So these are more tips for people that are trying to get into the industry rather than seasoned professionals. But yeah, so just practice, just keep going. And for 3D, particularly on the web, you definitely want to have some code knowledge. TypeScript, JavaScript, Python. You don't need all of those, but start with JavaScript, and you need some basic understanding for the most part, unless you have an entire team to work with your stuff on that. Let's see here. Yeah, so Python has like procedural world cases. If you're into that kind of stuff and that's your project, and it's useful for Blender plugins particularly. You could use it. I'm assuming Maya and the rest all have similar type of plugin systems, which also leads me to my next point: plugins and paid services. So texture library services are a huge help because it takes a long time to basically make the textures relative to like the mesh side of everything. So if you can just pay a service that gives you rights and access to a large library of textures, especially when you're starting out, that don't try to make the textures yourself initially. Use a library. And then that also goes for plugins. Even for the advanced people out there, if pay for your plugins if you can. It helps support the people making these plugins, and in many cases it can save days, weeks in some cases of time, like in optimization, UV map packing, a whole variety of things. So look at plugins on the various stores that kind of do that stuff, and also Blender has its own built-in like add-on system. And I've said it already, but practice makes perfect. All right. So if you're getting into this, it's not just, you're not just gonna get in and just make beautiful models immediately. You have to practice, and like I said, go on Sketchfab, download stuff, check it out, modify it. That's where I started, and go from there, and just keep iterating, and for the pros out there, innovation. That's all that is just more practice. And if you're set in your ways on doing a particular style, try different styles. Try something like Art Deco, a forest village, Middle Eastern style, or something even crazier like abstract, parametric abstract art. So in my case, like I was like 4 years into modeling, and I had pretty much maxed out my capabilities with a single style essentially, and I got a contract for 160 low poly models because my stuff was mostly high poly. So I got a contract for low poly to do 160 NATO classification objects for like some military simulator, 2,000 polys each. Yeah, it took me about 3 weeks, but by the end of that, I was like hugely fine-tuned my mesh manipulation skills in particular, so that it gave me a lot more knowledge and speed at doing complex geometries like this or like that, a whole bunch of other stuff. So yeah, practice and innovation. That's the only way to actually really get like properly good at doing this kind of stuff. So, but I'd like to open it up for Q&A, and I'd like to thank Kieran and the VRTO team for letting me speak, and thank all of you for listening. Ask me anything.